If you read much about Old Testament history, you have run across multiple references to the high places. And if you're like me, you've wondered exactly what was involved in those high places. Most of the time, they are directly associated with idolatry, with rebellion against the will of God, but not always. Sometimes they're just places. Sometimes they're places where the Lord God was worshipped. And in fact, sometimes it seems like God even approved of that worship. Was that really true? What I'd like to do here today is look at the way that the high places are laid out for us and see how the people use these high places for perhaps good purposes in some places, but mostly for evil purposes, and then make application to our own lives so that we'll make sure that we are worshiping God in the high place where we are required to worship, where it is appropriate for us to worship, and no other place than that. The story begins, for our purposes at least, in Deuteronomy chapter 12, as Moses is giving his benediction to the people. He lays out for us in Deuteronomy chapter 12, in the first few verses, the need for them to reject the customs of the people of the day. However popular they may have been, however enticing they may have been, they need to steer clear of such things and focus on true worship as God has designated true worship. The text reads, "These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall carefully observe in the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess as long as you live on the earth. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve other gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and burn their ashram with fire, and you shall cut down their engraved images of their gods and obliterate their name from that place. You shall not act like this toward the Lord your God." The way that they had been worshiping in the wilderness under the oversight of Moses, this was going to be carried over into the land of Canaan. But they're going to encounter other options, other habits. To a certain degree, of course, they knew that from Egypt, and they had engaged in a fair amount of that even in the wilderness. But hopefully, once they crossed over the Jordan River, they would be able to maintain a true faith and a true pattern of worship as Moses and later Joshua would guide them in. This included abolishing and destroying, in fact, what the text calls in Numbers 33, verse 52, and other places, the high places. These places where traditionally idol worship would take place. But here you notice in Deuteronomy chapter 12, it's not just the idols themselves. Also, those places themselves were supposed to be destroyed. We also read, as we pick up the reading, verse 5 in Deuteronomy 12, "You shall seek the Lord at the place where the Lord your God will choose from all your tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come. There you shall bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the contribution of your hand, your votive offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. There also you and your household shall eat before the Lord your God, and rejoice in all your undertakings in which the Lord your God has blessed you." This is a clear indication that there was going to come a time when they would worship collectively in a central location, a central hub of spiritual activity. They had known this to a certain degree in the wilderness because of the tabernacle. But there's some indication that the tabernacle, which survived for a while, at least, in the land of Canaan. It's a little fuzzy on exactly how long and how well the tabernacle survived, whether it was rebuilt at some point. But there's some indication that the tabernacle, as it existed in the land of Canaan, may not have been exactly what Moses meant here by this place that was chosen. If you pick up the reading in verse 8, we find, "You shall not do at all what we were doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes, for you have not as yet come to the resting place, the inheritance which the Lord your God is giving you." Now, he's probably talking there about the land of Canaan in general, rather than the temple. But there is some reason to believe that the tabernacle, as it existed in the wilderness and later on as it existed in the land of Canaan, may not have been precisely what the Lord had talked about in this text. There are passages such as 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 18, where it does appear that God approved of sacrifices that were offered outside of the context of any kind of national building that the people would have had. I think we can all agree, one way or the other, that when Solomon built his temple and it was inhabited by the presence of God, even in a physical sense, the Shekinah cloud of glory inhabited the temple as it had inhabited the tabernacle in times past, this showed to be truly God's house in a much fuller sense than any other kind of structure may have been in times past. Clearly, this is the fulfillment of what Moses had referred to back in Deuteronomy chapter 12. And so this was going to be the house where everyone would come and assemble and partake in these festivals that Moses had alluded to that were realized in the land of Canaan. This is where they would commune with God as a community, as a nation. Now, there would always be a temptation to not do that, to do something other than that. In fact, skipping ahead to verse number 29 of the same text here in Deuteronomy chapter 12, Moses tells us, when the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations which you're going in to dispossess, and you dispossess them and dwell in their land, beware that you are not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods, that I may also do likewise? You shall not behave thus toward the Lord your God, for every abominable act which the Lord hates they have done for their gods, for they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. God is distancing himself ahead of time from these pagan immoral practices that were going on in the land. He knew this happened. He knew it happened in the name of these foreign gods. And it showed how far these cultures had devolved morally and spiritually. He was determined to keep his people from going down this path, and staying away from the high places, staying away from these pagan rituals was a big part of that. I would like to think that sacrificing your children to a pagan god would be as unthinkable and as horrific to the people there in the wilderness in Moses' day as it would be to you and me. Nevertheless, Moses warns them. And as it turns out, by the way, people did, in fact, sacrifice their children to these pagan gods. People of Israel sacrificed their children to pagan gods later on in Israelite history. So this is not some worst case scenario that could not possibly ever actually exist. It did exist. Moses truly foresaw that not only would this be a possibility, but it would be a reality among God's people. And so therefore the warning goes out, as the warning often does go out in the book of Deuteronomy, to stay away from these influences, to keep themselves pure and apart from these awful, horrible, horrible places. Now skip ahead in time a little bit and in the text to Joshua chapter 22, where we find the response of the people in the land. And there's a very interesting story given to us here. As soon as the people have taken the land, taken possession of the land, there is a conflict that comes up among the Transjordan tribes. If you remember the story of Joshua, there were 2.5 tribes who did not take the land of Canaan. At least they did not inhabit the land of Canaan. Reuben and Gad and half of the tribe of Manasseh, they desired the lush pasture lands on the east side of the Jordan River before they had taken the land of Canaan, outside of the technical land of Canaan that God had promised them. Joshua had assured them, and Moses had assured them, that if they would go in and conquer the land with their brethren, they could have this land for themselves. And so they went in and they fought beside their brothers, and then they went home. And as soon as they did, the text says in verse number 10 of chapter 22, the people built an altar. When they came to the region of the Jordan, which is in the land of Canaan, the sons of Reuben, the sons of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh built an altar there by the Jordan, a large altar in appearance. Now, that may not seem like it's such a big deal, and later on they're going to insist that it's not a big deal, that this is not a violation of Moses' requirements, that it does not fall under the heading of a high place in the sense that Moses had directed. Skipping ahead to verse 26 and 27. This is not what they're trying to do, but that's not how it was perceived. The other tribes saw this altar and immediately assumed that they were breaking away from the properly designated form of worship that had been given by Joshua and by Moses. And they were ready to go to war over this. They were ready to destroy their brethren because of what turns out to be, apparently at least, a misunderstanding. They see this altar that is being built there as rebellious. You're worshiping in your place rather than worshiping in God's place. That's how they're painting this, at least. Whether the people actually were rebelling against God and got caught and made up a story and got out of it, or whether they're telling the truth in this situation, where they're saying that the altar was not ever intended to be a place of worship. It was a memorial that was built to remind them of what was going on the other side of Jordan. Either way, clearly this is an indication that the people took the high places very, very seriously in these early days. They had every intention to protect God's law, perhaps even to a fault. Was it appropriate for them to assume the worst of their brethren? Was it appropriate for them to go to war over this? The text does not allow us to give a definitive judgment on that, but clearly, at least we can agree on this, that the people took the high places very, very seriously in the early days. That was going to change, though. There are early signs in the days of the kings that their attitude toward the high places was changing somewhat. And we especially see this in the life of Solomon. Solomon, of course, became known later on as quite the idolater. He married these foreign women, and they worshiped their foreign gods, and he wound up joining them in these worship of the foreign gods. But notice here in 1 Kings chapter 3, in verses 1 and following, Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. People were still sacrificing on the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. Now that passage there in verse 2 seems to indicate that the high places were still being practiced because they didn't really have much of another option. If there had been a temple, they would have been worshiping at the temple rather than the high places. That may or may not be true, but that seems to be the way the text reads. Notice there in verse number 3, now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. Except he offered burned incense on the high places. That seems to indicate that it's a bad thing to worship the high places. But notice in verse number 4, the king went to Gibeah to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, ask what you wish me to give you. And that's the context, of course, where he is going to pray for wisdom to guide the great nation. And God clearly approves of his request. And the implication is that he's approving of this sacrifice as well. Is this a situation where they are compromising God's will or simply finding the best possible accommodation to achieve God's will? We may not be able to determine effectively and definitively where we stand here. Clearly, this is not what God's plan was, but Solomon was in the process, actively in the process of pursuing God's plan. He had every intention. In fact, he and his father David had already set plans in motion to make God's place, to fulfill this requirement. So was it okay to offer on the high places? Well, judge for yourself. I'm glad I'm not in a position to make those kind of judgments. It should be emphasized that no, the temple was not there to fulfill the prophecy, but at the same time, the Ark of the Covenant was not entirely homeless, that the Ark was among the people. David had taken the Ark into the city of Jerusalem and had stayed there in its tent. The text says in 1 Chronicles chapter 16 and verse 1. Was that the proper tabernacle? Were things being done in that tent the same way that they had been done in the tabernacle in times past? The text doesn't say anything about that. But I think we could certainly agree that a greater effort could have been made by the people of God to worship in God's way, to make a better effort toward doing things the way that God had indicated, and to abolish the local customs. The high places were there to be turned toward the worship of the one true God because they had not been destroyed. And they hadn't been destroyed because the people had not done it yet. They were told to destroy them, and they had not. Instead, they had incorporated it into their habit of Jehovah worship. Well, exactly how bad was that? Well, in the short term, it's difficult to say. But it is much easier to say in the long term. Skip ahead a little bit to the eventual results of this attitude toward the high places, this refusal to destroy these things of the pagans. In 1 Kings chapter 12, we see the people of Israel, by and large, rebel against the house of David. David's grandson Rehoboam was the proper king, the anointed king, the one they should have been serving, but his father Solomon, of course, had not been faithful to God. God promised him that he would remove the kingdom from him, and this happened under the days of Jeroboam. And when the people followed after Jeroboam, Jeroboam was very hesitant to allow them to go back to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. Any effort to go back for the Passover and for the Day of Atonement and for the other festivals that they were required to participate in, that would intensify their connection to Rehoboam, intensify their connection to the house of David, and weaken their connection to Jeroboam. He didn't want to do that. And so instead, what Jeroboam did was he created new altars, new high places, you might say. In 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 25 and following, we see him constructing these two golden calves. And what an irony. How amazing this is. Of all altars, of all idols that they would make golden calves. The historical connection couldn't possibly have been missed by Jeroboam, but nevertheless, this is the way they go. They make these golden calves and put one in Dan and one in Bethel, which is the southern and the northern extremities of Jeroboam's territory, and made it more convenient for them to serve in his places of worship rather than in God's places of worship. Clearly, at this point, a disrespect for the things of God and for the processes of God has gone way, way too far. And eventually, the high places themselves are going to become much more important in the lives of the people, and not just the northern tribes. They are going to be much more important with regard to worship than the things of God, than the temple of God. And even in those high places, Jehovah worship is going to be replaced by out-and-out paganism. Even the good kings that would step in and try to break this cycle, that would try to take these high places away, this cycle was very difficult to break. In chapter 15 of 1 Kings and verse number 14, Asa, this very good king, at least by and large, a very good king of the southern tribes, he was able to refocus the nation on Jehovah worship, but it says the high places were not taken away. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly devoted to the Lord all his days. Verse 14. He meant well. He tried well, at least in these early days he did. We'll talk about the later days of Asa maybe another time. But his efforts to focus the people on God and God alone were ultimately unsuccessful. Jehoshaphat, we're told of him that he walked in all the ways of Asa his father. He did not turn aside from it, doing right in the sight of the Lord. However, the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burnt incense on the high places. They were still deviating from God's plan, even under the leadership of the kings that were trying to isolate the people from idol worship. And clearly, if not by this point, it didn't take very long for idol worship to come back to the high places. It wasn't just a different way of serving God. It was a new way of serving the old gods, or if you prefer, the old way of serving the old gods. 2 Kings chapter 21 and verse number 3, the text says there, he rebuilt the high places, Manasseh, the son of Hezekiah, which Hezekiah his father had destroyed, and he erected altars for Baal and made an Asherah, as Ahab king of Israel had done, and worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served them. So here, idol worship was characteristic of the high places, and not Jehovah worship, not even a corrupted version. Manasseh, at a later time in his life, the text says in 2 Chronicles, was going to try to destroy these high places that he had built up. But by that time, it was part of the national culture. They wanted the high places, and if the king would destroy them, they were just going to build them back. This is an indication here that an attitude toward worship, a passive, lackadaisical attitude toward worship, eventually led to a complete abandonment of God himself. This is a very sobering lesson for us, and something that we need to take very seriously, because in our day and time, we are told oftentimes that the manner of worship that we choose, what we do, how we do it, is really irrelevant. The only thing is you just need to worship God. You need to serve God in the way that you like, in the place that you like, in the form that you like, and that'll be good enough. And this idea of that'll be good enough is not a new thing. God's people have always been told this is going to be good enough, and they have been wrong time and time again. Worship details do in fact matter. If God gives us a pattern, and again, we'll talk about that pattern maybe in more depth in another context, but there is a way in which God approves of worship to take place in a New Testament context. We can talk about the singing of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs in Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16, the partaking of the Lord's Supper, Acts 20 and verse number 7, that there are places that indicate how it was that people worshiped, and that pattern needs to be submitted to. It's also worth noting here that when we get an idea for worship from people who do not necessarily have any regard for the things of God, for the pattern of God, for the Word of God, these ideas are almost always bad. There are all kinds of things that are being done for entertainment purposes, for some kind of paganistic purposes, for some corrupted version of Jehovah worship that seem to have a certain amount of appeal, and certainly appeal to the people of the world. And the temptation oftentimes is for God's people to adopt those customs or modify slightly those customs and bring them into the assembly of the people of God so that we can worship more pleasing to men, as it were. The very idea that we would be prioritizing finding a pattern that appeals to people out there in the world, that ought to be a gigantic red flag that goes up for us here. If we are doing something because we think people of the world will like it better than what the people of God are doing, that should be an enormous red flag. When did we ever please God better by doing things more like the people of the world? That we may be like the nations round about us. This is the appeal that we see over and over again, not just for a king, but for other things as well in Old Testament times. And it was always a rationalization for deviating from God's plan. If we want to draw closer to God, we have to draw closer to the plan of God. And it's worth noting here also, before we close up, that we need to be very cautious in identifying false brethren. And notice here, I didn't say being slow to identify false brethren. I didn't say slow, I said cautious. The text says in Romans 16, verse number 17, that we're supposed to mark those who walk untowardly and have nothing to do with them. Being cautious about labeling somebody, being cautious about tagging somebody, and even taking measures to avoid somebody, that's not the same thing as proceeding slowly and slowly and slowly. If we are being cautious, that means simply that we examine everything carefully. We hold to that which is good. We abstain from every form of evil, as Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 21 and 22. That doesn't require slow action. That requires methodical action. That requires careful action. Once we decide what the truth of the matter is, and as often as not, the people who are transgressing will gladly confess to what they're doing. Once the charge is determined, once the truth of the matter is settled, we need to act decisively, including and particularly when it's an elder or a preacher who is the wrongdoer. Paul emphasizes to Timothy, 1 Timothy 5, verse 19 and 20, that you don't receive an accusation against an elder casually. You take that very, very seriously. But if you find 2 or 3 witnesses that back this up, then you have to step in and identify error, regardless of who may be the one who is promoting the error. So if we are going to be worshiping God effectively, if God is going to approve of our worship, if that's going to be our priority, we may find ourselves in a position where we turn a blind eye and a deaf ear toward the requests, the preferences, the habits of the people that are around us. I have no problem personally with modernizing, with adopting modern tactics, modern technology, things of that nature, but let's make sure we understand why we are doing them. Are we doing this as a more effective way of doing what God has always told us to do? Or are we simply appealing to the carnal and ultimately ungodly habits and preferences of our neighbors? If we win somebody to a gospel that is not God's gospel, we haven't won anybody. Not to God anyway. We may have improved our numbers, we may have flattered our own egos, but we are not serving God. The only way we can be lights in our community is by shining the light of Jesus Christ through the gospel that he has given to us. The same gospel that was once for all delivered to the saints, Jude verse 3. That same gospel that will guide us in everything pertaining to life and godliness, 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 3. By doing things in God's way, we can respect God's plan, God's arrangement, and ultimately glorify the God who's empowered us to do all these things.